Hey everybody, and welcome to History Recolored. I'd like to take a little bit of time, your time and my time, actually to read a couple of excerpts that I found about industry and the economy during the Civil War. Now this initially was put together by Benjamin T. Arrington of the National Park Service, and I do want to share some of it with you because it is kind of interesting. So when we think about it, back pre-Civil War, the American economy was caught in a transition. On the eve of the Civil War, what had been almost a purely agricultural economy in 1800 was in the first stages of an industrial revolution that would result in the United States becoming one of the world's largest industrial powers by 1900, right? We know it, we've seen it, we know the story. But the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the pre-Civil War years was almost exclusively limited to the regions north of the Mason-Dixon line, leaving much of the South far behind. And maybe that's where some of the problems started. In 1860, the South was still predominantly agricultural. It was highly dependent upon the sale of staples to a world market. And by 1815, cotton was the number one most valuable export in the United States. And by 1840, it was worth more than all other exports combined. So you think about that demand for cotton and how that drove the economy. And imagine cotton being worth more than all the other countries' exports combined. That's really something. But while the southern states produced 2/3 of the world's supply of cotton, the South had very little manufacturing capabilities like the North did. As a matter of fact, only about 29% of railroad tracks and only 13% of the nation's banks were in the South. That's a staggering offset based on North versus South. And that's what the whole Civil War was about, North versus South, right? The South did experiment with using slave labor in manufacturing. But for the most part, the South was totally satisfied with their agricultural economy. That was their number one business. And in the North, by a specific contrast, the North was well on its way toward a commercial and manufacturing economy. And that would have a direct impact on its war-making abilities. By 1860, 90% of the nation's manufacturing output came from the northern states. That's a lot. 90% of everything manufactured in the United States came out of the northern states. The North produced, now this is interesting, 17 times more cotton and woolen textiles than the South, 30 times more leather goods, 20 times more pig iron, the heck is pig iron, and 32 times more firearms. Those are staggering numbers when you think about it, right? The offset, North and South. The North produced 3,200 guns to every 100 guns produced in the South. Wow. That's a big number. Only about 40% of the northern population was still engaged in agriculture by 1860, as compared to 84% of the South. So we see the economies of scale. Agricultural, predominantly South, manufacturing, predominantly North. That's really gets you up here. The industrialization of the northern states had an impact upon the urbanization and immigration of the country. By 1860, 26% of the northern population, 26%, lived in urban areas led by cities of growth like Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit, and with their farm machinery, food-producing machine tool, and railroad equipment factories, only about 1/10 of the southern population lived in rural areas. A lot of land down there, a lot of farms, a lot of plantations, a lot of cotton growth. Again, cotton, big piece of the economy. And the free states attracted the vast, and the free states, now the North was considered free states, the South was considered slave states. And that's where that line was drawn. I mean, right? Like They call that the Mason-Dixon line. Free states attracted the vast majority of the waves of European immigration, and that was right through the mid-19th century. Fully 7/8 of foreign immigrants settled in free states. 7/8. That's, from a percentage factor, that's like over 90%. As a consequence, the population of the states that played in the Union was approximately 23 million. That stayed in the Union was approximately 23 million, as compared to a population of 9 million in the states of the Confederacy. So there's a country we're talking about here. What are we talking about? 32 million people total compared to what we have today. No wonder there was so much of everything available, so much land, so many opportunities. Just go get land and start homesteading it and building on it, right? So this translated directly into the Union having 3.5 million males of military age, and that's an important number. And that military age is the range of 18 to 45. And the South only had 1 million males of military age. Now, in the South, about 75% of Southern males fought the war. All right? In the North, only about 50% of the males fought in the war. Now, when we're talking about the war and the numbers of soldiers or military on each side, we're really thinking about the death toll and how that death toll impacts one side or the other, right? So if you have 1 million people in the war and you lose 50% of them, you only have 500,000 soldiers left. If you have almost 4 million people and you lose half of them in the war, you have, in this case, a little less than 2 million people left. So even those numbers are staggering. 2 million people in the North versus 500,000 people in the South to fight, the numbers are just offset, and you don't have a chance, right? Now, the Southern lag in industrial development did not result from economic disadvantages. There was great wealth in the South, but it was tied up in the slave economy. Everything in the South had to do with the slave economy. In 1860, the economic value of slaves in the United States exceeded the invested value of all of the nation's railroads, factories, and banks combined. Let me say that again. The wealth in the South was tied up in the slave economy. And in 1860, prior to the start of the Civil War, the economic value of slaves in the United States exceeded the invested value of all of the nation's railroads, factories, and banks combined. Now that tells you why the South was so adamant about their way of life and their economy and the impact on the rest of the country. So it's like two sides of every argument. One side is going to think that you're wrong, and the other side is going to think that they're totally right. Same thing here happened in the Civil War. One side thought they were very wrong, the other side thought they were very right. Personally, I didn't see anything right about slavery. I don't know too many people that did, but if you lived in 1860, obviously, and you were in the South, your economy was very pro-slavery. On the eve of the Civil War, cotton prices were at an all-time high. Big money for cotton. The leaders of the Confederacy were confident that the importance of cotton on the world market, particularly the demand for it in England and France, would provide the South with diplomatic and military assistance that they needed for victory. So the South was hoping that Europe would pony up and just give them money to fight against the North so that the Southern economy would win and we would have a Confederacy rather than the Union that we have today. Now, really what happened here is both the North and the South mobilized for war. The relative strengths and weaknesses of the free market and slave labor economic systems became increasingly obvious, particularly in the ability to support and sustain a war economy. you can't throw cotton and take out a soldier, but you can make a gun and kill somebody. And again, those numbers, 3,200 guns, every 3,200 guns that were made in the North, only 100 guns were made in the South. At kind of the odds are against you at that point. So as the war dragged on, the Union's advantages in factories, railroads, and manpower put the Confederacy at a great disadvantage. But let's face it, the Confederacy fought right through to the very end. Now, nearly every sector of the Union economy witnessed increased production, like mechanization of farming, right? Think about your tractors and all the automation. It allowed a farmer growing crops such as corn and wheat the ability to plant, harvest, and process much more than was possible when hand and animal power were used. Because let's face it, at one point in time, those were the only hand tools we had to grow crops. By 1860, right before the start of the Civil War, a threshing machine could thresh 12 times as much grain per hour. Now, threshing is when you take the wheat and you bang it and you knock off, the grains. A threshing machine could thresh 12 times as much grain per hour as could 6 men. That's a lot. So this mechanization became even more important as many farmers left home to enlist in the Union military. The Union needed the military to fight the Civil War. But then again, the growers needed the manpower. So by the invention of the threshing machine, just in this one example here, it freed up many farmers to go and enlist to fight the Civil War. Now, those that remained behind could continue to manage the farm through the use of labor-saving devices like reapers and horse-drawn planters. So in other words, some of the back to basics, if you didn't have these automated machines, you still had to forge on, so to speak. Now this is big, that northern transportation industries boomed during the conflict as well. And this really, in particular, means railroads. The North's large number of tracks and better ability to construct and move parts gave it a distinct advantage over the South. Union forces that were moving south were to fight often, and they rode to battle on trains traveling on freshly laid tracks. In fact, as Northern forces traveled further south to fight and occupy the Confederacy, the War Department created the United States Military Railroads. Now, I didn't know this, but the United States Military Railroads were designed to build train tracks or tracks to carry troops and supplies, as well as operating captured Southern rail lines and equipment. So as the war moved on, the North would capture Southern rail lines and equipment. And actually, by the end of the Civil War, it was the world's largest railroad system because it was all combined into one. Now, Northern industries, for example, like weapons manufacturing, leather goods, iron production, maybe that's where that pig iron comes in, I don't know, and textiles grew and improved as the war progressed. So the progression of the war from 1861 to 1865 forced, in fact, everything to become more than it was prior to the start of the Civil War. Now, in the South, that was not true. There were dual disadvantages of a smaller economy because they did have a smaller industrial economy, and having so much of the war fought in the South hampered Confederate growth and development. Because we're in the South's backyard, we're keeping them busy, we're fighting, we're blowing up things, we're burning things down, which I didn't think was right, but that took so much away from their ability to continue to grow, and all their growth and development was hampered just by the war itself. Now, Southern farmers, which included the cotton growers, were hampered, or their ability to sell their goods overseas was stopped because the Union had naval blockades up, so their product could not leave the country. Kind of like sometimes you think about what's happening today in the world. naval blockades and sanctions. It's kind of the same thing, but with a much more modern twist on it, because we just didn't have that knowledge or ability back in 1860. Now, Union invasions into the South resulted in the capture of Southern transportation and manufacturing facilities. So every step of the way, the Southern economy, while it was somewhat shaky throughout the war, it grew rapidly worse during the war's later years, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, which was big and signed into law by President Lincoln, enraged the South with its promise of freedom for their slaves and threatened the very existence of its primary labor source. Now, remember the numbers I gave earlier about the labor force of slaves? Massive numbers. So that put the labor force in the South on very shaky ground, offering them freedom. And again, slavery, I just didn't agree with it. The economy continued to suffer right through 1864, right, as Union armies battled Confederate troops in the Eastern and Western theaters. In the East, Ulysses S. Grant threw men and material at Robert E. Lee's depleted and increasingly desperate army. Grant took advantage of railroad lines and new improved steamships to move his soldiers, and he seemingly had an endless supply of troops, supplies, and weapons and materials that were dedicated to crushing Lee's often, now get this, ill-fed, ill-clad, undermanned army. Everything was against the South. But they fought on, had a lot of courage, and the amount of Southern men that gave up their life to fight for what they believed in was just staggering, all right? Now, the campaign of all that eventually fell into a stalemate at Petersburg, Virginia. Grant could afford to, as said in his own words, fight it out along this line as if it takes all summer. Lee could not afford to do that. Now, out west, we had William Tecumseh Sherman. His Union troops laid waste to much of the Georgia countryside during the Atlanta campaign and the subsequent march to the sea. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. When Sherman famously telegraphed Lincoln in December 1864, he said, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." His gift included about 25,000 bales of cotton. Again, cotton, huge money maker. And imagine a bale of cotton back then, sky high because of the demand. And yet 25,000 bales of cotton, wow, big, big money. And then Sherman estimated that his efforts down there, which eventually moved north and similarly impacted the Carolina area, caused $100 million of destruction. We're talking back in a time when a home, I don't know, $700-800 to build or buy a home. Think of that versus $100 million of destruction. Crazy. The South and the Confederate Army simply could not absorb those massive losses and continue to survive in the battle. It was doomed. Now, as the war progressed, substantial and far-reaching changes were taking place far from the battle lines. Lincoln became president in 1861. That was big. He became president without one single Southern electoral vote. All right? Lincoln was a Republican, anti-slavery. He faced a divided nation. But also, Congress at that time was also dominated by Republicans. And that's because many Southern Democrats left to join the Confederacy. The country was split in half. So Lincoln and the congressional Republicans seized this opportunity to put in place lots of legislations for their benefit. Now, that kind of sounds like today. The Democratic Party kind of went poo-poo after this last election, and now we have a Republican president and a Republican Congress and a Republican House, and that seems to give them the same kind of power that Lincoln had back during the Civil War, right? Now, most of the laws passed back during the Civil War set the course for the United States to emerge as an enormous economic engine and gave them the ability to have rapid Western expansion. That's where we were headed. We were headed west, all right? Now, foremost among all of these bills that were passed, there was an important bill called the Homestead Act. It was a measure that was regularly debated in Congress since the 1840s. Again, the country was wide open. And this law provided free title, imagine this, free title for up to 160 acres of undeveloped land outside of the original 13 colonies to anyone willing to live on it and cultivate it. That's a lot of land, 160 acres. It's way more than the whole neighborhood that I live in. I know that for a fact. Now, the Southerners had always opposed that idea, right? Because it would severely hamper any opportunity to expand slavery into these areas, because the Homestead Act, you could go into these places, get 160 acres, but you had to farm it or do and develop it and live on it and homestead it, but you couldn't use slavery, all right? Now, abolitionists viewed this, and now an abolitionist is someone that's anti-slavery. Abolitionists viewed this as a means to populate the West with small farms in the Homestead Bill. So in order to make the farms more efficient and help industries develop a new and better level of equipment and production, and as well as provide opportunities for students in industrial classes, in 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Act. It's the Land Grant Colleges Act. Remember that date, 1862. And that is where each state was granted land for the purposes of endowing agricultural and mechanical, A&M. So like Texas A&M, agricultural and mechanical colleges. The purpose of the act was to teach such branches of learning as are related to agricultural development and mechanics. There was an unprecedented national investment in higher education also, and it required instruction also in military tactics. Now, in 1862, specifically, something that was approved by President Lincoln on July 1st, and we just had the 4th of July, there was another major initiative called the Pacific Railway Act. This was the transcontinental railroad linking the East and West, kind of like the Homestead Bill, was heavily debated by pre-war Congress. Now we're in a war Congress now, and all of them are controlled by Republicans. Southerners wanted to build a railroad along the southern route, and Northerners, not surprised, wanted to build their railroads along the northern route. Once Southerners left Congress at the outset of the war, Republicans passed legislation that actually dictated a so-called middle route, an eastern terminus at Omaha and a western one at Sacramento. And the construction of the first transcontinental railroad meant jobs for thousands in factories, right? Producing things like tracks and tools, and as well as though that put in hard labor for years to lay the tracks across all the rough terrain. I couldn't imagine what that might have been like back then. It also meant a literal and symbolic linking of the East and the West, okay? Some people used to call that the golden spike, and they finished it all and connected it together, right? And it really ended up decreasing travel times for passengers and most importantly, goods and materials. And it provided commercial opportunities, the construction of towns along both lines, and a quicker route to markets for farm products, and other economic and industrial changes. Kind of like today with our trucking industry, right? We can get lettuce in California, but unless we can get it to the market pretty quick, it's going to spoil. So we have refrigerated trucks and drivers, and it gets there in a matter of days across country rather than, with a railroad, it would take, I don't know, weeks. So during the war, Congress passed several major financial bills that forever altered the American monetary system, or our money. The Legal Tender Act authorized the federal government to print and use paper money, and paper money at the time were called greenbacks. Those were used to pay America's bills and also finance the war. Now, even though greenbacks were not backed by similar amounts of gold and silver, creditors were required to accept them at face value, knowing that they were backed by gold or silver. Imagine what they used to say, by the full faith of the American government, right? At face value of the note. By the end of the war, this is important, the government had printed over $500 million in greenbacks. That's big money back then. And the American financial system's strict reliance on transactions in gold or silver ended. The National Bank Act was created and put in place a national banking system to reduce the number of notes issued by individual banks and create a single federal currency. The Internal Revenue Act, it helped ease inflation at the time, and primarily it placed excise taxes on many luxury items, such as tobacco and jewelry. So I guess tobacco and jewelry were luxury items back then. And most importantly, the first U.S. income tax was imposed in July of 1861. 3% of all incomes over $800, and up to 10% for incomes over $100,000 to help pay for the war effort. Imagine an income of over $100,000 back then. It just defies logic. Most people were making $800 or less a year. Now, for better or worse, the political philosophies that were underlying the creation of the Confederate States of America, with an emphasis upon its strong state and weak central government, coupled with its vast investments in slave labor-based agricultural economy, meant that the South had neither the ability nor the desire to develop the kind of industrial economy or centralized financial system required to sustain a modern war. So right from the get-go, they were behind the eight ball. No other way to slice it. And by contrast, the Union's willingness and ability to vastly increase the influence and footprint of the federal government not only contributed directly to its military success in the war, but it also transformed many other areas of national life, including the industrial, economic, agricultural, mechanical, and financial areas of the public, right? And to put it simply, the United States of America would be a very different nation today than had the war never been fought. If we are truly the world's last remaining superpower, then it is partially the massive industrial and economic expansion that was enabled by the Civil War that allowed us to ascend to that role in the first place. So I would like to thank the National Park Service who put some of this together, and I've read some of the excerpts from it to help formulate a better understanding of the industry and economies during the Civil War. And I hope my presentation and explanation of this has provided you with some sort of benefit. So I wish you a good day, and I wish you to thank you for watching. Take care.